Thank you for joining us today for the fourth webinar in our series of Tennessee Farmers Market Bootcamp webinars for farmers market vendors and managers and other direct marketers. My name is Hal Pepper, and I'm an extension specialist with the University of Tennessee Center for Profitable Agriculture. Our topic today is You Are Worth It, Defining the Real Cost of Your Products. And our presenter is Raederle Clay with Wins Four Quarters Farms. We appreciate our sponsors very much. Our sponsors include UT Extension, the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, and the Tennessee Association of Farmers Markets. And we also appreciate those who have collaborated with us to provide this workshop: the Farmers Market Coalition, the Center for Profitable Agriculture, and Oklahoma State University. As many of you are aware, attending all 5 webinars this week will fulfill a TAEP educational requirement in the producer diversification sectors of agritourism, fruits and vegetables, and value added. I'll be sending out an evaluation after tomorrow's webinar to everyone who registered, so I hope you'll plan to look for that and take a few minutes to complete that evaluation. Raederle Clay is our presenter today. Red is an Idaho native, and she grew up on a small family farm near Stanley, a town known for being one of the coldest towns in the contiguous United States, where she learned about cold climate growing. She earned her associate's degree in website design and management at Idaho State University, and she works in their IT department, along with running Wins Four Quarters Farm. She lived in Minneapolis for 10 years, during which time she started a thought experiment to answer the question of how much room would be needed to create a self-sufficient, biodynamic, and sustainable homestead. After returning to Southeast Idaho, she began working on refining that thought experiment and turning it into a reality. Red is going to show us the model she developed to identify and track costs and explain how to use it in setting prices for our products. And I emailed this to everybody just a few minutes ago, so hopefully you have that email and you can bring up that spreadsheet if you like as we have the presentation. So Red, we're very excited to have you with us, and I'm turning over the microphone to you now.
Thank you, Hal. I am really excited to be here. This is just kind of an awesome thing for me to be involved in. And one thing I didn't have Hal mention is I'm actually running the Blackfoot Farmers Market this year. So I'm the market manager. So this is one of these things that I like to have available for my vendors as well. So I will go ahead and share that pricing model spreadsheet that Hal mentioned, and we'll start going through it. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me, or you can save it to save your questions for the end. Either way works for me. So fundamentally, as I'm sure you're all aware, the process of pricing your products basically comes down to the cost of your materials, the cost of any equipment that you might be using, the cost of your labor, and then some sort of a markup so that you have a profit margin, and then also your sales tax if you have sales tax on your products in your state. My workbook that I sent around, or that Hal sent around for you guys that we're looking at here on the screen, is my pricing model for the various products that I sell at the farmers market. I will say that this was not a trivial thing to set up the first time when I was initially setting it up, but now that it's set up, it's very easy for me to go in and make updates and adjust my prices at my farmers market based on any changes in costs. The other thing is that it's really easy to share. I at one time had a couple of vendors at another farmers market who were upset that my prices were lower than theirs, and they wanted the farmers market board to evict me from the farmers market. I was able to print off this pricing model and sit down with the board of directors for the farmers market and show them, here's how I got my prices. And that very quickly put an end to that argument. I'm not sure the other vendors were very happy about it, but the board basically said, well, if you can do it for that price, they should be able to as well. So it makes that process very easy and relatively painless, at least for you. I also used this pricing model worksheet when I was working on getting financing for my farm here. And I was able to use it to create some income projections for the farm that were then used for the financing. So the first worksheet that you guys will see on here is the static costs worksheet. And I call it static costs, but they're not really static. Some of these prices change. For example, I actually just bought some microgreens, some soil for microgreens yesterday, and the price for the soil's gone up by about 50 cents for a 2 cubic foot bag. So I will actually now need to update this price. And then I can show you guys how that propagates out through the other tabs when we get to that point. The reason I have this is that a lot of these items are used in multiple locations throughout the pricing model. So this gives me one spot where I can update it. And then I have formulas in the other worksheets that reference that price. So it propagates that change through my pricing model without me having to go through and update every single product with that. I do try to do an annual review on the price of things. Some things I kind of update as I go. For example, the microgreens seed, I tend to update that anytime I purchase more seed, which is, a couple of times a year, depending on how much is being sold at any given time. So I've got this broken down into several sections. We've got, materials. So there's a lot of soil involved with the materials. That's about all I've got in here. I've got labor costs based on some of the common tasks that I do. So for example, here's the farmer's market. And so here's what it costs me per day to be at the farmer's market. Then I've got utility costs. This is one of those things that some people don't bother to calculate in the utilities. They do tend to be very small dollar amounts, so it's not that big deal in terms of your price if you exclude them. And I do have some things like this water cost is based on my local municipality. I'm actually on well water. So my cost is probably a little bit lower, but the nice thing about getting the municipal water cost is that it figures in all of the infrastructure that they use to get water to their customers. So there's the pumps, there's all the plumbing and everything that's used. So this dollar amount factors that in. And I don't have a good way to calculate that based on my well water usage. I've got space costs for items that are rented. The field rental price, for example, is based on the property cost, how much I paid for my farm versus how much I'm actually cultivating and what that price works out to be. So it's not really a rental price, but it's how I figure in how much does the land actually cost me to use it per day, per square foot. And then I've got mileage costs, which this is really mostly for the farmer's market aspect of things. So I get whatever the federal mileage rate is, because that's what my CPA uses when I do my taxes. So then the next tab is this market items units per week projection. This is based on my past harvest and sales records. This is not a complete sample of what I sell, but it gives you kind of an idea of what things might look like in this spreadsheet. Its purpose is for amortizing the labor for operating the market. So that's coming back to this $276 every market day. This tells me, okay, here's how many products I had at the market that day. And then I can amortize that $276 across all of those units and factor that price into each per unit price. The other thing it does for me is it shows how many items, or those units of items, are going to my market each week. How many things I'm spending time setting up. That kind of tells me here's how much competition any given item has each week. But then it also shows me how much competition each item has over the course of the whole season. Our next tab, this is the very most basic pricing model you can have. This is a real resale product. One of my coworkers has beehives, gets a lot of honey. She doesn't want to go through all the hassle of trying to sell it and deal with all of the rules around labeling and everything else. So I buy it from her. She bottles it. I buy it from her. Then I put on my 25% markup, put on the tax price, and then set what my final price is for it. So these are the different sizes of bottles that she gives me. We do some by the gallon. We've got a couple of customers that like to buy 3 or 4 gallons every year. And we just arrange that on an as needed basis. And I don't really get anything out of that. I just coordinate for her to meet with whoever the customer is to make the exchange. And so here's the amount that I pay her for each one of those bottles. Now, a 25% markup is a 20% profit margin. And a lot of times you'll hear people talk about those and it sounds like they're the same thing, but they're really not. A 25% markup is you're adding 25% of your original cost back to it. The reason that's a 20% profit margin and not a 25% profit margin boils down to something like this, where let's say you have a product that costs $100. Well, a 25% markup would make it worth $125. Now your profit is $25. Oh, go ahead. Did you have a question? I guess not. Okay. So your profit.
That might just be somebody that's just now connecting. So
yeah. All right. So your profit on this is $25 because that's how much over the $100 you're getting for it. But if you divide that $25 by your actual sale cost, which is $125, that's only 20%. So that's the difference between a markup and a profit margin. Anybody got any questions about that? I know it can be a little confusing. All right, and in my area in Idaho, we have a 6% sales and use tax. So after I put my markup on, then I put that sales tax amount on. My next step is then I round to the nearest 10 cents. A lot of reasons why I use 10 cents. One is that 50 to 70% of my sales at the farmer's market are in cash, and it's a lot easier to deal with dimes and quarters than it is to deal with pennies and nickels. The other thing is that the formula to round to 10 cents is very simple. Excel does not have an easy way to round to 25 cent or 50 cent. You can very easily round up to $2 as well. Just by changing the formula to say, okay, I want to round to the point that's in front of the decimal instead of after the decimal. So a lot of a lot of farmers markets, they like to round to the nearest dollar because it's easier to deal with. If you're dealing with whole dollars, then you don't have to deal with change. And that's totally up to you. That's a personal preference. One other note, anything that is highlighted in red like this is something that I have to fill out manually. That's not calculated. Anything in black is generally some sort of a formula that's based on something that I have entered somewhere. So the next tab is just a little bit more complicated than the honey. This is for my craft goods. I do some crafts. That's kind of a side gig besides my farm stuff. The kind of thing that, you know, I do in the wintertime when there's nothing else going on. Very simply, here's a list of the materials for each product. Here's what the average cost is of those materials for each product. And here's what my average labor time is for that. Then I have calculated what my labor cost is. And some of you, if you've looked at this spreadsheet, excuse me, you may have noticed that under labor here, I have two prices. I have professional labor at $30 an hour, and I have an amateur labor at $15 an hour. My primary income as far as the farm goes is produce. So that's where my professional wage goes. I put most of my effort into growing produce, and I charge $30 an hour. I charge professional wage for that. The craft items are just hobbies. They're things that I do to keep my hands busy in the wintertime. So I don't charge $30 an hour for them. If I charge $30 an hour for them, some of these things like this pot holder, I would have to charge $100 for it. And nobody's going to pay $100 for an 8-inch pot holder. Doesn't matter where you're at. So I use the $15 an hour. Now, one kind of note with that is that as your skill improves with doing a craft item, the amount of labor, the amount of time you're putting into it decreases. When I'm doing pot holders, my first one will take a couple of hours to do, just to kind of get it back into the rhythm of doing it. But if I do 4 or 5 in a row, by the time I get to the 4th or 5th one, I'm down to 45 minutes instead of 120 minutes. But I don't change the price on the product. So now, instead of 120 minutes at $15 an hour, it would be, I'd have to do the math on that. I of course had to pick a random number. Oops. So now I'm making $40 an hour by the time I get to that 5th pot holder, but I'm still charging the same price for the product. So that's kind of one of those areas, one of those gray areas where if you charge a little bit lower, but you can do it faster, then you're actually making more money per hour without having to raise the price to your customers. Now we'll start getting into kind of the more complex pricing models. My microgreens one is relatively complicated. I have each material is listed. I've got seed, I've got soil cost. Now the soil cost, this is calculated. So this comes back to this price up here, based on how much soil I use in a tray. And I use the same amount in each tray for pretty much all of the varieties. There's a little bit of variation for some of the varieties. So I've got all of these individual materials costs, which for microgreens, mostly seed and soil. I've got individual labor costs. So I've got, you know, the amount of time it takes to water the trays when they're germinating versus when they're mature. the amount of time it takes to harvest, to wash them, to package them. Here's my amortized market price, calculating that out. And then I also have all of these utilities. So I've got heat, I've got lights, I've got a fan that runs that keeps the air circulating in my greenhouse. And yeah, a heater to maintain the general temperature. And then I do supplemental lighting for anything that's in my greenhouses. Each item, there's different treatments based on their stage of life. So when I first plant a tray, they go into a dark chamber, so they don't have any light costs. They have a dome on them, which helps reduce water costs and also eliminates the interaction with the fan. So really the only thing that they have during germination is time on the heater. So I actually calculate that in here. I've got the days that they're germinating and the days that they're maturing times the cost of running that heater. Once they have germinated, I move them out. That's when they go under lights. The dome comes off, so they're affected by the fan, and they get more water because they no longer have the domes on them. All of my microgreens are grown in a greenhouse. I don't grow them outside. So I have this grow space requirement, which then factors down here into the greenhouse space cost. This tells me how many, so I know how many units I get per tray. That's based on harvest records and experience. And I know that each tray is 2 square feet. So I can divide that 2 square feet by the number of units and find out, okay, here's how much square footage in my greenhouse each unit requires to grow. Then I got over here, I've got my greenhouse price. So if you've bought any buildings or gotten financing to build buildings on a farm, you know, usually you get like a 7-year financing. My greenhouse cost $2,500 to build. Of course, I didn't get financing for something that inexpensive, but I amortized that price over the 7 years as though I had gotten financing for it. My usable square footage that's in there, so that excludes walkways, you know, anything that isn't used for growing, is 96 square feet. So if I divide all of that out, my price per square foot per day is just over 1 cent per day. Now I know that I have, each unit takes just under half a square foot per day. So if I multiply 0.4 times 0.01, I get basically 0. So in terms of the actual expense of growing these in a greenhouse, I don't have hardly any expense in the growing process for the greenhouse space. Yellow items that I've got highlighted here, we'll kind of come back to these in a little bit. These are items that are so trivial that I could probably exclude them from my pricing model, and it wouldn't have a significant impact on my final price. The cost would still be there. You can't just eliminate that expense, but instead of being factored into the cost per unit, it would actually just technically come out of my profit margin. And it's such a small amount that you can't hardly even put a dollar amount on it. It does not really affect your bottom line, time all is said and done. Now, Microgreens Combinations, I sell my microgreens in packages. Each pack, I've got different types of packages, and each package has a different combination of the microgreens that I grow. I try to have 2 of each variety available each week, unless I have specific requests for something more. But just by default, I try to have 10 packages of microgreens, 2 of each variety available. So now I know, okay, here's how many ounces of each of these I need to grow. That comes back to this number here. So in order to have that many ounces of each of these microgreens, this is how many trays I have to grow based on that number of units per tray in order to produce these combinations. Now that I know how many of these I've got and I have my final price down here, I can calculate here's how much the microgreens actually cost for each of these samplers or for each of these packages. Then I have my cost for the bag that I use. I use cellophane bags that I get from Uline. So they're really fairly cheap. And I print my own labels. So I've got fairly minimal costs there in terms of the actual product, the label product. It's like 1 cent. It's very small. And then I've got my total cost per bag. Now I've got my final price where I round that up. Now you may notice I don't have an item in here for the 25% markup or for the tax because I've already got that figured in here. So I use this price to fill out these items. So therefore I don't have to add tax. I do have to put the tax on this one because these static cost items that I've got over here, I did not figure tax in on those. Now I'll kind of show you if I take these items out, this is the effect that it has on here. So this is the original price before I remove those items. This is the price if I remove those items. So as you can see, it makes about a 2 to 5% price difference. So I could very easily leave those items out of my pricing model and not really be losing any money on selling microgreens. Any questions on that? Okay. This is arguably my most complicated pricing model. This is for my field crops, which very similarly to the microgreens, they have different stages of life and they're handled differently depending on what the product is and what their life stages are. So this first one here, peas, as I'm sure a lot of you probably know, most people don't transplant peas. They just go straight out into the garden. So that affects this planting time number. It takes me about 10 minutes to plant 270 peas. And one of the reasons it takes such a small amount of time is I do have a seeder. So I pour my seeds in, I walk down my row, and I'm done. Doesn't take very long. Definitely one of my better equipment purchases in terms of efficiency. All of these other items are started in the greenhouse and transplanted out. So they have all of these additional costs associated with being grown in the greenhouse and then transplanted out. So instead of planting time that I have for direct sowing, I have the time that takes to make the soil blocks, which I use rather than like trays, and a transplant time. And as you can see, it takes a fair amount more time to do that. So anything that I can plant out directly in the garden, I would rather do that because it takes less time and therefore it's less expensive. On average, about 70 to 90% of my costs are my labor. So anything I can do to trim labor, that lets me reduce the price that I'm passing on to the customers. One other thing, I don't know how many of you have used soil blocks. There are 3 sizes available. I mostly use the 2-inch soil blocks. I do occasionally use the 4-inch soil blocks for certain crops, like cucumbers. When I change this up to 4, you can see that it takes more time to make the blocks. And all of these other associated costs change because they take up more space on the shelves. Therefore, each block is actually consuming more of the utilities, more of the heat, more of the lights, more of the fan, because I can have fewer of them on each shelf that those lights and the heaters are on. So that's just a simple drop down. I can change that. I have learned with tomatoes, I don't need the 4-inch blocks. A lot of people recommend using the 4-inch blocks. I don't need them. I'm able to do them in the 2-inch blocks and they grow just fine. So I save myself a fair amount of cost there by not using the 4-inch blocks for my tomatoes. Days to maturity. I know a lot of people probably wondering now, wait a minute, why are these so long? This isn't what matches the seed packets. This is set based on my previous harvest records for each crop or each succession of a crop. And it's set to whatever the latest harvest date is for that crop. The reason I do that is because that's how long you are actually taking care of that crop, whether it matches what's on the seed packet or not. This is actually how long I'm taking care of that crop. The main impact that has is on how much water I'm applying. Because the longer they're out there, the more water they use, the more frequently or the more times that they get watered over their lifespan. My units, these are based on if I'm pre-packaging. So peas are I generally sell in half-pound increments. The cherry tomatoes, so Blankofchen is a cherry tomato. I sell those packaged in 6-ounce clamshells, basically. I don't actually use clamshells, but I use a different packaging. So I do 6 ounces of each of those. The larger tomatoes, so this is a beefsteak tomato, I sell by the pound because a lot of those tomatoes are between half a pound and 1 pound when I sell them. The clementines are they're not a cherry tomato, but they're about halfway in between size-wise a cherry tomato and a beefsteak tomato. So I sell them by half-pound increments usually. Lettuce, I usually sell by the head. So that's a count per unit, or there's 1 unit per plant, essentially. And again, we've got units per harvest and harvests per season. That's based on my harvest records and harvest and sales records. Then I've got my harvest, washing, and packing time. For those who don't know, there's a wonderful tool called a bubbler for washing produce. This allows me to wash an entire crop in about 30 seconds. Excuse me, the units, it costs 30 seconds per unit to wash an entire crop. So if I've harvested 5 pounds of peas, it takes me about 2.5 minutes to wash them. And I can do the whole crop at once instead of having to do each one individually, which would then take a minute per. So then it would cost me 5 minutes instead of 2.5 minutes to wash the whole crop. Packing time, this is for putting them into bags. Sometimes this applies ahead of time, like for the peas and the cherry tomatoes, where I package them ahead of time and put a label on them. Sometimes it's based on here, okay, I know that this is how long it takes me to put a pound of tomatoes in a bag for a customer at the farmer's market. Harvest space requirements. This is based on how much space a unit takes up. An 8-ounce package of peas takes up about 6 inches by 6 inches by 1.5 inches. Divide that by 1728, which is the number of cubic inches you have in a cubic foot. That's how many cubic feet a unit, an 8-ounce package of peas takes up in my cooler. So for that, I have to fill in, here's the dimensions of the package. Clamshells for the cherry tomatoes for 6 ounces is a 3 by 4 by 5 inch clamshell. This cubic foot per harvest. So this is based on, I know that I get, a pound of peas each week when I harvest, and I get 3 weeks of harvest off of them. Well, a pound of peas therefore takes up, because there's 2 units in it, it takes up twice as much space as that. So that's how much space in my cooler on that day going to market the peas take up. Here's my amortization of the cost of doing the market. And this is just adding up, here's the total number of kilowatt hours for the time in the greenhouse, which for peas is 0, but then for the rest of these, it adds up a certain amount. The total amount of water, which is added up from the amount of water used when they're in the greenhouse, as well as the amount of water applied when they're actually out in the field. And the total amount of time that I have spent on them. So that's your time to make and plant them, transplant them, or plant them directly outside.
Hey,
And
can I real quick?
Sure, what's up?
So do you keep up with all of these numbers yourself, or do you have employees helping, or what?
I am a 1-person operation, so it's all my own time. I do all of this by myself, yeah.
Okay, so like when you're picking your crops, you're literally counting everything that you pull out of the garden. Are you doing that as you're pulling it out? Are you doing it when you wash? Like what is
I usually do it when I wash, because sometimes, peas are a great example for this, so are tomatoes. I'll be going through them and picking, and I usually pick the morning of market. So I'm out there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning doing this, and it's dark, and I'm doing it with a headlamp. So I do occasionally pick something that isn't quite ripe, or is overripe or damaged. So then when I wash them, I'll pull those out. Once they're washed, then for like the peas and the cherry tomatoes that I pre-package, then I'm weighing those out as I go. The other ones that I sell, that I don't pre-package, that I just sell them at the market, I record not only how much I harvested after I've washed them, so the total amount of harvest. I also then record how much I sold, which then allows me to adjust, how many plants do I plant next year? If I consistently sell out of the cherry tomatoes, well, maybe I want to plant some more cherry tomatoes next year. That's actually has happened to me with peas. I grow one variety of shelling peas, and those sell like hotcakes around here. I have doubled my space on shelling peas every year for 3 years, and I still sell out within about the first hour and a half of the farmer's market.
Are you shelling them, or do you sell them still in the shells?
I sell them still in the shells. So it's up to the purchaser to do the shelling. If I was trying to do the shelling on those, the price would be astronomical, because they do take a fair amount of effort to shell.
Sorry, can I ask one more question, then I'll stop and let you get back to it. Where do you find your packaging, and what do you find works best?
Most of my packaging I get from Uline. They sell in large cases, and they have discount prices if you buy multiple cases at a time. I'm small enough, I don't usually buy multiple cases, but they do have that, like the cellophane bags that I use for the peas and the cherry tomatoes and the microgreens are like, I want to say they're 1,000 bags for $75.
Can you put that in the chat so that way we can look at it? And To piggyback kind of off of that question, our silly question, you weigh everything and you charge it by the weight. So do you weigh it with the bag, or sorry, do you weigh it with, like, so radishes, do you weigh it with the stem? Do you weigh it without the stem? Kind of, how do you do that sort of thing? Or how do you recommend doing it?
So in terms of the packaging, I do tear my scale out. So the packaging does not figure into what I'm charging. Admittedly, the cellophane bags are so lightweight that they wouldn't really have an impact on that. But I do tear them out. I used to sell microgreens in canning jars, and I would harvest them. So I'd take the whole tray with me to the farmer's market, and I would harvest them there as customers asked. And so I would put the jar on the scale, tear the scale out, and then I would fill the jar with the microgreens, and then I would charge them for that volume of microgreens. As far as like radishes, it kind of depends on how you're selling them. If you're selling them by the bunch, so you've got them already packaged, maybe, with a rubber band around them. The radish tops are edible. So I would absolutely charge for the price of the tops and the radishes. I have with carrots, what I have done at times is I will separate the tops from the carrots, and then I will sell the carrot tops separately. Because those are also edible, in case you didn't know that. In fact, I grow carrot microgreens. I'm seeing some questions in the chat here. So I'm going to real quickly, I'm going to try and get back to all of these. Tamlin, you asked how I define a cup. That is an imperial cup. So, 2 cups per pint, 2 pints per quart, 4 quarts per gallon.
I just wanted to make sure, because like, if I give my dog a scoop or a cup of dog food, it's just some random weird device that I found. So I just wanted to make sure that yours was an actual cup and not, you picked this up from your house somewhere.
Yeah. I do the same thing when it comes to feeding my livestock. I've got, whatever random container happened to be available at the time. So I get that. But yeah, I anything in here that's cups, pounds, inches, what if it is standard, whatever that is, and standard and American, not no metric in this.
And what were you saying you use instead of the clamshells?
I use the cellophane bags. So they are, I'm trying to remember what the actual size are. They're like 2 3/4 by 4.5 by 8 or 9. Gusseted cellophane bags, so that when they open up, they'll stand up like a paper lunch bag. And so here's on here, we've got the price of that. So it's $232.79 for a case of 1,000 of those bags. So that, in terms of the amount of material cost, they're really cheap. One of the reasons I use the cellophane bags, and I have only been able to find these at Uline, is that they are actual cellophane, which means they are made with plant materials, plant fibers, which means they can go in the compost. So when the customers take it home, they have that option of, hey, instead of throwing this out, I can put it in my compost bin, assuming they have a compost bin. Odaris, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. Where did I learn the formulas to use for these? Most of them are actually pretty straightforward: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So to do them, you start out with the equal sign. That tells Excel that it's a formula. And then you put in whatever your numbers are for calculating. You can reference other cells. Let's see if I've got, so like this one here, I know that it takes 1/4 minute to water a tray in my greenhouse. So I can multiply that cell times the cost per minute, which is 50 cents. That tells me it costs me 13 cents per minute to water a tray in my greenhouse. They do have, Excel has a wizard. So if you're not sure what formula to use, you can click this FX button to insert a function, and it will help you kind of walk through writing a formula.
Readily, I might point out that we did
We're
some
getting long.
training. We did some training on how to use Excel a couple of years ago, and I've put in the chat box how you can access that training. There were 2 recorded sessions, and there was a fact sheet that we developed to use as a handout along with that training. And if you go to our Center for Profitable Agriculture's website and click on resources and type in Excel in the search box, you'll find those 2 trainings and that fact sheet. So that may be helpful to someone who doesn't have a whole lot of experience with Excel or who just wants a refresher.
Thanks, Hal.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. This is Odara Sprunk. And yeah, I'm old school. I like to write things down on paper. So if an Excel spreadsheet is not already formulated, I am totally lost. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I have set this up so that for the most part, you don't have to edit any formulas. If you actually want to use this pricing model, all you have to do is fill out your numbers in those red highlighted rows, and it will do all of this calculation for you.
Very good. Thank you.
Dana, you asked about options for scales and how to get certified. That's going to vary by state. So you'll want to talk to your state Department of Agriculture. They'll usually have a department called something like weights and measures that you can reach out to. They can tell you what kind of scales you need, and they can do the certification for you. I will say one difference, at least in Idaho, this may vary again from state to state, so your mileage may vary. In Idaho, if you pre-package, you have to follow labeling requirements, but you do not have to use a certified scale for it. Basically, what you have to do is you have to put a little bit more into your package than what your net weight on your label says. And then you don't have to have a certified scale. But if you are weighing produce out at the farmer's market as people are purchasing it, then you have to have a certified scale. And yeah, in terms of which scales are allowed, again, you'll really want to talk to your State Department of Agriculture to find out about that.
Ed Coleman with Tennessee Department of Agriculture Weights and Measures. He is our administrator for our state, and I put his contact information in the chat box.
Awesome. Thank you, Al. Well, we're getting kind of low on time, so I'm going to real quick. Somebody had asked me to put something in the chat, and now I don't remember what it was. Whoever that was, can you remind me what it was you were asking?
She had to ask you to put the U line in the chat, and
Oh, okay.
that, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just uline.com is their website. All right, so real quick here, we'll hit this fresh herb pricing. So I do fresh herbs. That's another thing that I do at the farmer's market. Almost all of them are transplants. So I start them in my greenhouse and I transplant them into pots rather than out into the field. And then I take the whole pot with me to the farmer's market and I cut it fresh to order for customers there. Couple of things to note, because I do put them in pots, I actually use a formula here. This is based on your standard formula for the area of a circle. So pi r squared. I start out with 8-inch pots. I have a few that I have 10-inch pots. And I do gradually, as the plants get bigger, I move them up into larger pots. I calculate that as a circle because when I water them, I'm putting water in the pot, and I put in about a 1/2 inch of water in the top of the pot each day. So that's how I calculate how much water I'm using. Technically, in terms of field space, they are actually still taking up a square because a circle fits inside a square. And if you've got rows of circles, you've got all of that space in between. I do adjust that a little bit by, instead of doing straight rows, I do staggered rows. But then I also grow like peas and oats and stuff underneath where I've got those setting outside. So I use that for green manure that then I harvest and put in the compost. So I'm not totally losing that space. So then the other thing with this is the mileage on these compared to the mileage on some of these other items is quite high. So for a lot of these items, you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 cents per unit for mileage. On my herbs, we're talking 15 to 30 cents. And that's because I'm taking the whole pot. And by taking the whole pot, that's taking up a lot of room in my vehicle to transport. One way I could help reduce that cost would be, instead of taking the whole pot and cutting it fresh to order at the market, I could cut it ahead of time and take it prepackaged. Then instead of taking up, half a square foot or even a full square foot for the in the cooler in my vehicle, it would take up like 1/10 of a square foot, much smaller space. And the last one,
I'm so sorry. How do you measure the time? Because I was looking at the time and it says like 0.105. So is that
this one?
the harvest time up top?
Ah.
Oh, yeah. So even
Yeah.
harvest time, setup time, tear down time, what is that based off of? Is that seconds?
So it's minutes per unit. And basically I say, okay, I've got 6 plants. And I know from again, this is kind of experience talking. I know it takes me this much time per square foot of pretty much any type of produce I'm growing to harvest.
Ooh,
So
okay.
that's what the static cost B44 is the time per square foot it takes to harvest.
Okay, so you have done, wow. Okay, so you,
Yeah.
for 6 plants, you've kind of measured and figured out how much square foot that individual plant takes. And then you've kind of timed yourself to see how long it takes to harvest those plants. And then, oh, okay, I like this.
Yeah. So this is where I'm saying, you can get as complicated or as simple as you want when it comes to your pricing model. It all depends on your level of comfort and how detailed you want to be when you're doing it. So, and then real quick here, I'll go kind of over the dried herbs. These are a value-added product where I try to have 3 of each type of herb growing, because if I trim one all the way back for a harvest, it takes about 3 weeks for it to then bounce back to a point where it's ready to harvest again. So that's why I grow herbs in increments of 3. You may have noticed on here on basil, I grow 6 because basil is really popular. So I can very easily clean out 2 or 3 plants in a week for orders on that. So I do.
Of your setup.
I'm sorry?
You have a picture of your setup by chance?
I do not have any good pictures of how my setup is. I've got, a few random things here and there, but I am actually intending this year to, with everything being set up, to actually get nice pictures and say, to show here's how this is set up. But yeah, I do not have any real good pictures at this point. So yeah.
Do you, for your row, is everything, okay, so I'm just gonna assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you kind of start your plants indoors and then transplant them into the dirt.
Right.
So now do you have kind of like that perfect row setup? Or do you have like a walkway and then the plants, and how big is your garden outside? Just Sorry, I'm trying to get like a
Oh, that's-
feel because we have, I think, like an 80 by 40, and I'm just trying to set it up.
Let me see if I can. This is going to be really probably pretty small and hard for you guys to read, but I'll kind of show you. I use Excel for basically everything. This is, hopefully you guys are seeing this now. This is what my garden layout looks like. So I have walkways, that's this brown stuff. And then I have for each plant, I have a square that says, okay, here's how much space this plant is taking up. And yeah, I do have it planned out. I use color coding. You know, I get pretty crazy with my Excel usage. So that's kind of what my garden plan, this is this year's plan, is what you're looking at here. And I do put, okay, let's get zoom back in here. So I actually have this measured out. So I put a box around it. This is, 10 feet and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So each cell is a 1-inch square. So this is a 4-inch square. So that takes up 16 square inches. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. If you can put that in the chat, if you don't mind, or email that out to us, so that way I can kind of piggyback. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I do apologize.
No, that's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can, this has like all of my notes in it from the last couple of years. So I'll get a cleaned up one and I'll send it to Hal. And Hal, if you'd be so kind as to send that around for everybody.
I'll be glad to do that.
All right. Well, we're about out of time, so I'll try and hit the dried herbs here real quick. I sell these as dried herbs, and so what I try to do is each week, if I don't sell everything, I go ahead and harvest it and I throw it in the dehydrator, and then I crumble it up and put it in jars. And so sometimes, it'll take 6 or 8 weeks to fill a jar. But then the jars I also get from Uline. This is their cost per unit to get the jars. One thing I could do that would make this a little more accurate is I could throw on what it takes to run the dehydrator. I don't currently do that, but that's something I could do to make my final price more accurate.
I had a question here. Do you have, so the 25% markup, it seems you use that for several things. Is that across the board that you try to do that?
Yeah, my intent is to have a 20% profit margin on everything that I sell.
Okay. And is that just like, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to like, but is that, did you just kind of, how did you come up with that? Like, I know some retailers try to get more closer to 40%. I was just curious, because to me that is a big, why not make 30% if the market can handle it? I'm just trying to get inside your head here. I'm not trying to, push you. I'm just curious.
Yeah, truthfully, the main reason I did that is because the 25% markup and calculates to the 20% profit margin very cleanly. When you start talking about, a 30% or 40% markup, then your profit margin becomes kind of a weird number. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sorry, I had unmuted myself again. Yeah. Okay, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's just for my peace of mind and being able to easily think about, okay, here's what I'm making on this.
Gotcha. Okay. And do you ever do, I hadn't just dissected your sheets yet, but do you ever do I guess obviously you don't, but I was thinking about, for us, certain crops take so much more labor, and I know you're calculating that, but that it's just not worth it to us unless it is making more money, that sort of thing. But you just keep it pretty much the same for everything.
Yeah, I have found that as a general rule, I can figure the amount of labor based on either the number of units. So for example, with the transplanting, I've got 6 that I'm transplanting, and I multiply that number times, I know that it takes 30 seconds for me to put a 2-inch soil block in the soil.
Uh.
So it's either based on that, or like with the harvest, I've found that no matter what crop it is, it takes me about this much time per square foot of that crop to harvest.
Yeah, okay. Cool, okay, thank you. Thank you for the Excel file again.
Yeah. Let's see, and I saw somebody asked about getting the pots for the herbs. I get those at Home Depot or Lowe's. I use terracotta, so I start with 8-inch terracotta pots. I do not get the saucers for them. I just get the pots. If my consulting fee is $30 an hour, yeah, that's if I'm doing consulting, which I don't do very often, I do on occasion. I do charge $30 an hour for that. But I will tell you, I do not calculate in to my cost how long it takes me to order seeds. That's just one of those things that I figure that's coming out of my profit margin. I do, because I have been growing for long enough, I have a pretty good idea of what varieties I'm going to grow. And with that spreadsheet that shows how many I'm planting, I can fairly easily say, okay, here's how many I have left from my order from last year. Here's how many I need to order this year. And I can usually place my seed orders in about 2 to 3 hours across about 5 vendors that I typically buy from. Deborah, for keeping records, I will recommend this to everybody if you're interested. There is an application out there, at least for Android. I think they have it for iOS, and it is called SmartSteader. And you can set up crops, and you can record your harvest, you can record your sales, you can record your expenses. I've put it in the chat. It's called SmartSteader. And I love it. I use it for all of my tracking on that, for harvests, for sales, everything. I use that. Hal, I see somebody asked about regulations in Tennessee for drying herbs. In Idaho, they're considered a cottage food. So they can be done with just a cottage food registration. You don't even need a license for it in Idaho. Minnesota had, when I was living there, they had a license if you sold more than $5,000 a year. Then you had to pay $50 a year for a cottage food license. Otherwise, it was free. I don't know if Tennessee's different. Maybe Hal, you can address that.
Yeah, Mike Brown is going to be with us tomorrow and doing the webinar, and Mike would be a good one to ask that question to. I put his contact information in the chat in case there's anybody that wants to contact him directly and get that answer, but otherwise we'll ask him to address that tomorrow.
All right, fantastic. Where am I purchasing seeds from? The vast majority of my seeds I get from Seed Savers Exchange. They're predominantly heirloom and heritage varieties of seeds, open pollinated, not hybrids. And I just love the varieties that they have. They have some wonderful flavors. All of these ones that you see here on this field produce screen, I get from Seed Savers. My secondary is Johnny's out of Maine. And then I also get a few from Territorial and Urban Farmer Seeds. And I get some of my herbs from the Thyme Garden. So I put those in the chat here. And I know we didn't quite get through everything in this spreadsheet. I am happy to give out my contact information, my email address for you guys. If you have questions and you want to ask questions about it, I am happy to do that for you guys. So I've put my email in the chat. I will make sure that it's included in the spreadsheet with the map of what I'm growing as well. So you guys will have that. So if there are other questions, we can go over that, or Hal, if we need to be wrapping up, I don't know if you have a hard stop or anything.
Well, as long as you're available to answer questions, I don't want to impose on your schedule, but we can take a few more minutes if you have the time.
Yeah, I absolutely have the time. If you guys want, we can go ahead and kind of go over the last couple of things that I had in these spreadsheets, so you guys can get some idea of some of the other things that I do and some of the reasoning behind my pricing. One of my goals with the farmers market is I want to be able to sell my produce for no more than 10% higher than what the grocery stores locally sell a comparable product. And comparable is kind of the key word there. I grow everything biodynamically, which is kind of that next step beyond organic. I do not use any herbicides, any pesticides, any fungicides at all. I do not use synthetic fertilizers. A lot of organic produce in the grocery store, they do still have certain herbicides and pesticides that they're allowed to use. And because of organic certification rules, they are pretty much required to use synthetic fertilizers if they do any fertilizing during the growing season. So on these, the field produce and the fresh herbs and the dried herbs sheets, I've gone out to one of our local grocery stores that does online ordering here and just grabbed screenshots of a few of the items that I grow and what their prices are currently for them. And then I'm comparing that to what my price is. So I know, I'm selling peas in half-pound increments. By the time so when I multiply that all together with my markup, I'm coming out at $7.99 a pound. That grocery store sells organic snap peas for $10.64 a pound. So I'm actually coming in 25% cheaper than the organic snap peas at the grocery store. Lettuce is one of those. Lettuce takes up a fair amount of space. I started in the greenhouse. So there are a number of things that actually raise that price. So I'm actually 27% higher on a head of romaine lettuce than what the grocery store is selling for right now. 10%. James, that's kind of my goal, is for anything that I'm selling that's produce, beef, eggs. And I will tell you, eggs are one of the ones that I do not get within 10%. There's just no way. Really, if I was actually charging for labor for eggs, I would have to be charging about $12 a dozen to accommodate my labor for eggs. So I charge $4 a dozen, and that's break even on materials costs. That's it. So their feed and the egg carton is basically all I'm getting paid for on eggs. But yeah, for something like beef, pastured pork, pastured beef, pastured chicken, I've got meat rabbits, which unfortunately I can't sell retail around here because the state requirements for getting them processed for retail are obscene. I'm just going to leave it at that. Yeah, my goal is to be no more than 10% over the cost of the grocery store. Egg cartons, I just get mine at the local feed store. They're like, depending on which store I happen to hit on which day, there's usually between 60 and 70 cents per carton for 1 dozen size cartons. One other little kind of fun exercise for you guys. I'm sure some of you have seen these little packets of fresh herbs that you can buy at the grocery stores. And they're ½ ounce or sometimes even 1 ounce packages. So when you're looking at these packages and you compare that to what my cost is, I'm actually charging nearly double what the grocery store is charging per unit, per 1/10 of an ounce. However, if you have ever tried to cook with those fresh herbs, if you're going off of a recipe, it's going to call for, you know, 1 sprig or 2 sprigs or a cup or, you know, some volume. And it's almost certainly going to be smaller than that package that you're buying. What I have found is that typically for a recipe, you want about 1/10 of an ounce. So, you know, somebody goes to the store, they buy this 1/2 ounce package for $2.29, but then they're only using 1/10 of an ounce. So then my price is actually half of what they're paying at the grocery store because they're throwing out 80% of what they bought. One of the big exceptions is for things like pesto. 1 cup of basil for pesto is about 1 ounce of fresh basil. Darlene, I think you're maybe referring to the Smart Stutter app. That's an app for your phone or your tablet.
Red, I would go back to that question that James asked about beef and the cost and pricing of that. There's so many variables to consider with raising and finishing animals, and you know, the final grade of that finished animal in terms of, you know, and how long it takes you to finish that animal if it's grass finished. There's just a lot of things to be considered. Your spreadsheet provides an excellent model for someone to capture their costs. It could easily be modified to incorporate the cost of raising and finishing that animal, and then the slaughter cost and all of that. But
Yeah.
just a lot of things have to be considered with
Yeah,
selling
you would have, you'd have a totally different set of costs, you know, in terms of what your labor would be and what, you know, if you're giving them grain, how much that is. And I have done that with my poultry, which is why I know that it would cost me, you know, I'd have to charge $12 a dozen for eggs if I wanted to pay for my own labor. So for me, eggs are just a value add product. They get people to stop in my booth in the market. And very rarely does anybody come to my booth and only buy a dozen eggs. They might come there for eggs, but then they'll leave with a package of microgreens or a head of lettuce or something else as well. One thing I might be worth noting for you, James. So I just had a pastured hog butchered, and I actually drove all the way to Colorado to get it to my grandparents' house and brought it back here to Southeast Idaho to take to a butcher here because nobody in Colorado could get them in before May. The final cost, not counting the actual driving down to Colorado to get it, worked out to, I believe it was $3.21 a pound to have her processed up here, including what I paid the person who raised her. In February, the USDA report for pork, just your CAFO raised pork that you get at the grocery store, not pastured, was $3.50 a pound. So she actually came in a little bit under the grocery store price for that. And even when I figured in the fuel and everything to drive down to Colorado and back and have her processed here, she came in at like $5.70 a pound. And that same report from the USDA had pastured pork coming in at $6.25 a pound.
This has really been a very useful model that you've shown here, Red. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your sharing this with us today. This is just a really great time-saving. You only have to develop this on your own, folks. She has done all the work for you, and it's just it really blows my mind the detail that you've incorporated, capturing all of these costs And thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
You are very welcome. This has been a great experience for me. I've loved talking with you guys and answering questions. And this is the kind of thing I love doing. This is why I do farming.
Well,
Very
Mrs. Clay, is there a way to contact you to sort of like pick your brain and say, hey, this is what I'm working with, this is my idea? Just because I don't want to put a lot of like insecticides, pesticides and things like that on my garden I don't want to kill all the healthy stuff and the good bugs. So is there a way to contact you or email you and say, hey, this is a picture of what I got, this is my plan, kind of set it up, use your model, and you don't even have to respond, just yep, or I would fix this.
Yep. And I just put my email address in the chat. So you guys can grab that, and I will include it on the spreadsheet with the map of my growing plot for this year. So you guys can have it in that as well.
Oh, yes. So that would be awesome. Thank you so much. Because just I'll be reaching out. I ask a lot of questions. Sorry.
No, that's great.
And then Mr. Howell, you're going to send out that second spreadsheet.
Yes, I'll be glad to send that. Red's going to do a little cleaning up on that, I think. And when she has that ready and sends it to me, I'll be glad to send that out to everyone. And I'll also be sending the links to the recording of this and the other webinars. I plan to send that out tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will try to get that spreadsheet cleaned up today so that Hal can either send it out today or tomorrow.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you, Red. I really appreciate your joining us today and providing this information. I thank all of you who have joined us, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow when we'll hear from Mike Brown, business consultant with TDA, and Mike will answer some frequently asked questions about foods and farmers markets. So I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks again for being with us. And I will leave this chat up for a while for those of you who may want to take screenshots of that, or, I don't know if Red's available, but if you are, and there are any additional questions, can hang on for a few more minutes just in case there's anybody else.
Yeah, sure. I can hang around for a little while.
Thank you.